They say God is silent, but the silence is not divine. It is the echo of repression, the unanswered cry we buried in the cathedral of the self. The prayer you whisper in the dark isn't always a request. Sometimes it's a disguise, not for salvation, but for evasion, not from hell, but from memory. Religion didn't fail you. Your interpretation did. Because it wasn't God you were speaking to. It was the Father you couldn't confront, the wound you moralized, the guilt you transfigured into doctrine, the punishment you called holy because it spared you from the unbearable confrontation with the truth that your suffering wasn't chosen, it was inherited. Handed down like an unspoken script, you clung to the cross, not because it promised redemption, but because it mirrored your inner crucifixion. The superego wrote its commandments on your bones long before you read them in any book. What you called faith was often a compromise, a pact with an internal tyrant who demanded obedience, not understanding. So much of what we call spiritual is psychical, and so much of what we call God is projection. The divine, distorted through the lens of trauma, filtered through the veil of repression, sculpted by the fantasies we dare not name. You think you abandoned religion, but what if it was never yours to begin with? What if it was an inheritance, wrapped in the language of duty, shame, and unspoken fears? What if you followed the ritual not out of belief, but out of internal necessity, a way to manage unbearable contradiction within? We don't kneel only to God. We kneel to lost fathers, to the mother who was absent even when present, to a childhood etched with confusion, where silence replaced affection and duty became the only language of love. And we call this morality. But the psyche is not moral. It is structured by forces that are indifferent to your virtue. Desire is not obedient. Guilt does not ask for your permission. And repression works silently, surgically, removing the unbearable and placing it where you can no longer find it until you repeat it. You don't believe in God? That may be so. But tell me, why do you still feel punished? Why does pleasure evoke shame? Why is the voice in your head not yours when you fail, but always yours when you succeed? We internalize more than values. We internalize conflict, and we mistake that conflict for truth. We mistake obedience for goodness. We mistake suppression for discipline. But the unconscious does not mistake anything. It simply records, and it repeats. The unconscious has no gods, only compulsions. And if you trace the path of your suffering backwards, if you descend, without flinching, into the catacombs of your mind, you will not find divine judgment. You will find psychic compromise. A child protecting what could not be processed. A system of meaning erected to stabilize what was too chaotic to confront. This is not blasphemy. This is psychoanalysis. Because the truth is, many who flee religion have not fled belief. They've fled the tyrannies they unconsciously attach to it. They have not questioned God. They have questioned their capacity to survive without a system that managed their shame. You did not abandon faith. You disowned the fantasy it was hiding. And this disowning, this is what the psyche calls trauma. The fracture, the split, the disconnection between what we feel and what we're allowed to name, between what we suffer and what we're allowed to make conscious. Freud did not dismantle God. He dismantled the illusion that we seek God without seeking ourselves. Every prayer is a confession, not to a deity, but to the unconscious, to that hidden tribunal beneath your awareness, where guilt is eternal and desire is always on trial. So when you knelt, were you worshiping, or were you avoiding? Religion didn't fail you. You misrecognized its psychic function. You mistook fear for faith. You mistook obedience for understanding. You mistook repression for transcendence. The divine does not exist outside the human psyche. What you called God is a projection of internalized authority, built to regulate your guilt and fear. It is not an external being, but an inner construction to manage unbearable emotions. But something inside you did, and that something is not divine. It is internalized authority, a moral superego formed in the crucible of childhood conflict, an echo of the law laid down before you had the words to resist it. And what you thought was God watching was your own gaze, projected, hardened, turned back upon you with judgment and expectation. This is why psychoanalysis must descend, not to destroy faith, but to reveal its foundations, not to strip away meaning, but to uncover the unconscious scaffolding that gave that meaning its emotional weight. Because if you don't go inward, you remain in exile, not from heaven, but from yourself. And what we call the self is not a unified soul, but a divided psyche, structured by the conflicts between the id, ego, and superego. We split to survive. We split to function. We split to love the ones who hurt us without confronting that they hurt us. We call this repression. We call this adaptation. We call this morality. But it's not salvation. It's survival. And survival is not freedom. Freedom, if it exists, is born from the wreckage. When you no longer idealize what betrayed you, when you stop moralizing what hurt you, when you stop calling your wounds sacred just because they came wrapped in religious language, it is not enough to renounce belief. You must trace its architecture in your psyche. You must walk back through the temples built out of guilt. You must ask, where did this image of God come from? Who does it protect me from? Whose face is hidden behind the mask of the Almighty? The ego will not like these questions, because the ego is loyal not to truth, but to coherence. But coherence can be a prison, and the unconscious has no loyalty to the ego's myths, only to what was split off. So, if you truly seek truth, not comfort, not redemption, but truth, you must leave behind the God who functions as your defense. You must dare to meet the absence you once called divine. You must stare into the void, not to find meaning, but to see what meaning was protecting you from. Because meaning is a defense, a bulwark against the chaos we once drowned in. And the sacred, perhaps it begins, not in belief but in honesty. Honesty about your wounds, your longings, your repetitions, your defenses. Religion didn't fail you. Your psyche made it into something it was never meant to be. It became your superego, your guilt made manifest, your ungrieved losses turned into rituals, your rage turned into doctrine, and your hope became a plea. Let someone make this make sense. But there is no making sense of pain that was never meant to be processed, only survived. There is only the return, the descent, the confrontation, not with God, but with the self, the one you left behind when the world demanded a version of you that could not feel and still function, and the one who waits, still beneath the rubble of repression, waiting, not to be saved, but to be seen. That is the beginning, not of faith, but of truth. And truth is the only sacred thing we have left. But truth is not gentle. It does not console. It does not arrive cloaked in revelation or wrapped in transcendence. It arrives as a crack in the mirror, a disruption in the script, a symptom that refuses to be ignored. The very moment you think you've outgrown the past is when it reappears not as memory, but as compulsion, as repetition, as unexplained dread pulsing beneath your daily rituals. You do not remember it because you were never allowed to feel it. And what you cannot feel, you cannot integrate. So it lingers, disguised as fate, haunting your relationships, your choices, your beliefs. We call this the return of the repressed. Not because it knocks politely on the door of consciousness, but because it invades silently, symbolically, somatically, the stomach that churns during stillness. The sleeplessness that no caffeine can explain. The thrill of guilt after moments of joy. These are not random. They are coded messages from the parts of you denied expression. And if you listen closely, you may hear beneath the surface a story without words, a narrative without permission, the unconscious autobiography of your suffering. But we were taught to look outward, to externalize what is internal, to see morality as law, not as adaptation, to believe that suffering must have a purpose, and if it doesn't, we must create one or else descend into madness. So we take our pain and moralize it. We call it growth. We call it strength. But what if it's just disguised compliance? What if what you call discipline is simply fear that has learned to speak the language of virtue? What if your resilience is built on the ruins of what you once disowned, not recovered? This is the tragedy of the misunderstood psyche. It speaks in symptoms because it was never given language. It acts because it was forbidden to speak. And so we develop theories, religious, philosophical, ideological, not to understand ourselves, but to shield ourselves from knowing what we are truly carrying. We cover our wounds with explanations. But the wound does not care about your theories. It wants recognition, not interpretation. It wants to be named, not moralized. The unconscious has no interest in meaning. It records what happened, not what you believe about what happened. It is indifferent to your justifications. It stores what the ego rejected, what society deemed inappropriate, what family considered unbearable. It stores what had to be split off in order for the image to survive the good child, the loyal believer, the functioning adult. And what is split does not disappear. It waits. It finds detours. It expresses itself sideways, through shame, through sabotage, through illness, through silence. And silence, true silence, is never peaceful. It is full of what was never said, full of the truths that had no audience, full of the feelings that had no witness. We do not suffer because we are weak. We suffer because we were not permitted to speak the truth of our experience. We suffer because the conditions for psychological safety were absent when the self was forming. And so we formed around the absence. What you call you is a compromise, an internal settlement between what you desired and what you were allowed to desire, between what you feared and what you had to pretend not to fear, between the unbearable truth and the necessary lie. The ego, your sense of self, is not the author of your life. It is the editor. It selects, it organizes, it censors. It arranges the fragments into a coherent narrative so you can function in a world that demands consistency, not authenticity. But underneath that narrative is the raw material, the primary process, the dream logic of the unconscious, where opposites coexist, where desire defies morality, where you love what hurts you and hurt what you love, where guilt lives side by side with longing, and the fantasy you hide from others is the only place where you feel safe enough to exist. And still, you wonder why you cannot be present, why joy feels foreign, why love comes with conditions, why intimacy triggers fear. It is not because you are broken. It is because your earliest experiences taught you that being fully yourself was dangerous. And so you adapted, you split, you silenced, you learned to smile when in pain, to nod when confused, to excel while dissociating. You built a self that could survive the conditions, not challenge them. But the body remembers. The body always remembers. It stores what the mind cannot hold. It expresses what the mouth cannot say. It speaks in tension, in fatigue, in patterns of collapse and overdrive. And still, we pathologize it. We call it weakness. We try to fix it without listening to it. We forget that every symptom is a message from the unconscious, a symbolic expression of a deeper reality that words have not yet reached. We were not designed for repression. We were forced into it by systems, by caretakers, by culture, by trauma. And then we blame ourselves for the symptoms that repression produces. We call it sin, we call it disorder, we call it personality. But none of these names reach the root. They label the surface. They manage the expression. They do not liberate the truth. Liberation is not transcendence. It is not escaping the human condition. It is not becoming pure or whole or enlightened. It is recognizing the mess and daring to stay with it. It is looking at your past not with condemnation, but with clarity. It is seeing the architecture of your suffering, the logic of your defenses, the necessity of your adaptations, and refusing to judge them because they were not failures. They were survival. And what survived in silence is now asking to be known, not fixed, not erased, just known. But to know it, you must walk through the gates of resistance. You must confront the protectors of your unconscious, the parts of you that fear knowing, because knowing would threaten the structure, the internal sentinels who confuse awareness with danger, because that's how the psyche learned to survive. Resistance is not weakness, it is loyalty. Loyalty to the ego's fragile coherence. Loyalty to the fantasy that what happened didn't really happen, that it didn't matter, that you were fine. But you were not fine. You adapted, you compensated, you excelled, perhaps, but at a cost. And the cost was paid in silence, in inhibition, in the slow erosion of aliveness. So here you are, years later, with success but no satisfaction, with relationships but no intimacy, with routine but no presence. Because the psyche cannot be tricked by surface. It wants truth. And until the truth is spoken not as confession, but as recognition, it will find other ways to express itself, through anxiety, through addiction, through collapse, through the aching feeling that something is missing, even when nothing is. This is the soul's protest, not for God, not for meaning, but for the self you left behind in the name of survival. And the journey, if we can call it that, is not upward. It is downward, inward, into the layers of sedimented experience, frozen affect, distorted meaning, into the shadowed places where the child still waits for someone to notice, not to save them, just to see them. Because to be seen is the beginning of integration, not just seen externally, but internally by your own gaze, turned inward with compassion, not judgment. The unconscious does not demand perfection. It demands honesty. It demands that you stop pretending, that you stop blaming yourself for adaptations that were never your fault, that you stop worshiping a version of God who mirrors your inner critic more than your inner truth. Religion didn't fail you, but it did give you a script. And if that script erased your inner world in the name of obedience, then it's time to write another, not a new belief, but a deeper understanding. One that includes the pain, one that integrates the contradictions, one that no longer calls your symptoms failures, but evidence of what you endured and what you still carry. This is the work, not to escape the unconscious, but to listen to it, not to transcend suffering, but to decode it, to trace the symptom to its source, to follow the thread backward through memory, through fantasy, through silence, until you find the moment you split, the moment you learn to betray yourself in order to belong. And when you find it, do not judge it, witness it, stay with it. Let the feeling you never felt finally move. That is what healing really is. Not cure, not erasure, but movement. The movement of frozen truths into conscious awareness. The movement of what was hidden into the light of your own gaze. You do not need to be saved. You need to be seen. And seeing begins with turning toward what the ego was built to conceal. But turning toward it will not feel noble. It will feel like failure, like weakness, like betrayal of the very defenses that kept you upright. Because your ego is not an enemy, it's an architect. It built you a shelter from unbearable truths. And now you are asked to step outside of it, to re-enter the very storm that once nearly drowned you. This is why people resist analysis. Not because they don't want to know, but because knowing costs something. It costs the myth of innocence. It costs the fantasy of control. It costs the illusion that we are purely rational beings, immune to the wounds of childhood or the politics of memory. The unconscious is not a myth. It is not a metaphor. It is real, and it is alive, speaking constantly in dreams, in slips, in projections, in the strange attractions and repulsions we cannot explain. You may not know its language, but you live by its logic. Every time you sabotage what you want, every time you fear love, every time you compulsively seek what hurt you in a different form, that is the unconscious not trying to punish you, but trying to complete what was left unfinished, trying to bring the wound back into awareness through repetition, because that is the only way it can be felt fully, finally metabolized. But you don't want to feel it. Of course you don't. No one does. That's why repression exists. That's why we build belief systems, religions, ideologies, to keep pain at bay. Not just any pain, but the most primal kind. The pain of being unseen. The pain of being alone with unbearable truth. The pain of being a child in a world too chaotic to explain, too dangerous to understand, and being told that the feelings you had in response were wrong, that your anger was sin, that your fear was a lack of faith, that your sadness meant you didn't trust the plan. And so, you mistrusted yourself. You turned against your own affect. You split feeling from knowing. You became what they needed, not what you were. And you called it growth. But that's not growth. That's adaptation. Growth is different. Growth is what happens when you go back and reclaim what you left behind. When you make contact with what you buried. When you take the hand of the part of you that still lives in the silence and say, I will not abandon you this time. This is the integration Freud spoke of. Not a cure, but a making conscious. A dragging of the unconscious into awareness, not by force, but by invitation. It is painful. It is slow. It will undo you because it must. The self you built to survive cannot carry the weight of the truth you're ready to feel. It must be dismantled, gently, reverently, so that something more whole, not perfect, but real can emerge in its place. This is why true psychoanalysis is not popular. It offers no quick fix. It sells no redemption. It demands presence, not performance. And presence is intolerable to those who have spent their lives escaping themselves. You've asked for peace, but peace is not possible while you're at war with your own history. You've asked for freedom, but freedom cannot coexist with denial. You've asked for clarity, but clarity only comes when you allow the fog of repression to lift, and with it, all the pain it was hiding. You think you are lost, but what if you're just split? What if the part of you that feels distant is not gone but buried beneath layers of adaptation, beneath inherited scripts, beneath religious meanings that serve to explain what was never supposed to happen in the first place? God didn't fail you, but maybe you were taught to make him into someone he never was. Maybe you were told that obedience was love, that punishment was divine, that silence was sacred. But the psyche does not find holiness in silence. It finds abandonment. It finds confusion. It finds contradiction. And the contradiction must be metabolized, not rationalized, not prayed away, but named, felt, understood. You are not the problem, but the story you inherited may be, the theology that taught you to fear your own body, the morality that condemned your desire, the community that punished your questions. These are not God. These are defenses. They are institutions built to manage collective trauma. And if you don't question them, you will confuse their authority for truth. But truth does not demand your submission. It demands your reckoning. And reckoning is terrifying because it means walking back through the doors you locked long ago. It means letting go of certainty. It means grieving not only what you lost, but what you never had the chance to want. It means meeting yourself, not as you should be, but as you are, incomplete, longing, wounded, real. This is the return. The return not to belief, but to the body, to the memory, to the moment before the split, before you called your pain divine and your silence holy, before you turned your suffering into virtue because no one taught you another way to hold it. You were never meant to carry it alone, but you did. And now finally it is time to lay it down, not in the hands of a God who mirrors your inner critic, but in the hands of your own awareness. To say, I see you. I remember. You don't have to act out anymore. You don't have to shout through symptoms. You don't have to scream through silence. You are known now. And in that knowing, there is space. Not comfort, not joy, not yet, but space. And space is how healing begins. Not because the past changes, but because you do. Not into someone new, but into someone whole. And wholeness is not resolution. It is not the erasure of contradiction, but the capacity to hold it without splitting, to feel pain and not dissociate, to feel anger and not collapse into guilt, to feel love and not mistake it for danger. This is the labor of becoming, not in the eyes of the world, but in the intimate theater of the psyche, where every role you've ever played still echoes: the compliant child, the invisible one, the redeemer, the sinner, the perfectionist, the one who holds it all together. They were all necessary. None were false. They were you filtered through survival. But survival is not life. And until you loosen your grip on the survival self, you cannot feel what was always out of reach. Presence. Not the curated kind, not the performance, but the raw, disarmed kind, the kind that doesn't ask if it's worthy, because it remembers it was never a question. To arrive there, you must unlearn what protected you. You must say goodbye to the gods who mirrored your oppressors. You must release the internalized voices that made your desire feel dangerous and your truth feel excessive. You must stop calling repression spiritual. Stop calling avoidance strength. Stop baptizing your silence as humility, because none of it was holy. It was fear made sacred through repetition. And repetition is the language of the unconscious. What we cannot speak, we live over and over again. We date it. We marry it. We work for it. We worship it. until something breaks or awakens. And awakening is violent, not because it harms, but because it disorients. It strips away the false center, the borrowed story, the sacred scripts that told you who to be in exchange for never having to feel what you actually are. It shatters the ego's demand for coherence and invites in what was long disqualified: grief, rage, hunger, despair, longing. These are not enemies. They are the return of the exiled self. And when they arrive, do not pathologize them. Do not send them away with theology or medication or false forgiveness. Listen, they carry the truth of your past and the key to your future. But listening takes courage, not the courage to fight, but the courage to feel, to sit in the quiet chamber of the psyche and let the echoes speak, to let the ghosts of memory reappear without rushing to make them mean something noble. Sometimes there is no nobility. There is only pain. And your task is not to transcend it, but to attend to it, to let it move through you, without moralizing, without silencing, without exiling it again, under the name of grace. This is the inner revolution, the unglamorous slow dismantling of internalized repression, the defiance of inherited narratives, the refusal to spiritualize your erasure, the decision, finally, to stay with what is not, what should be. Because the truth is, you were never too much. Your pain was never sinful. Your need was never shameful. Your body was never the enemy. But the systems around you couldn't hold that truth, so they made you doubt it, and you adapted, because you had to. But now, you don't. Now, the invitation is different. It's not to become pure. It's to become honest. To let the contradictions coexist. To be human without apology. To tell the truth of what happened not just with words, but with presence. And in that truth, a strange thing happens. The defenses begin to soften. Not because you destroyed them, but because you no longer need them to survive. You've grown strong enough to feel, strong enough to remember, strong enough to stay. This is not faith. This is not healing. This is not enlightenment. This is integration. The slow stitching together of what was split. The reanimation of what was frozen. The return of what was denied. You will not be praised for it. You will not be celebrated, because the world rewards the mask. But you will know, and knowing, truly knowing, is the only sacred ground we ever stand on. Everything else is performance. Everything else is exile. And so this is where the journey leads, not to triumph, not to certainty, not even to peace, but to presence, to the place beneath illusion, where nothing is resolved but everything is real. The fantasies fall away not with violence, but with gravity. The myths you lived by, of salvation, of punishment, of being chosen or forsaken, dissolve into something quieter, a human truth, unadorned, unbearable, and yet still yours. No one comes to rescue you here. No light splits the sky. No final answer rises from the ruins. Just you stripped of the false gods and the borrowed guilt, facing the wreckage with eyes finally open. There is no reward for this, no applause, no closure, only the return of what was once exiled, the child who wasn't heard, the pain that wasn't believed, the truth that couldn't be spoken. And now, maybe it can be, even if only to yourself, because that is enough. To know, to see, to feel, to stop abandoning yourself in the name of others' expectations, spiritual, familial, societal, internal, to stop calling survival salvation, to stop mistaking silence for strength. This is not healing. Therapy does not heal in the way you imagine. It makes conscious what was unconscious, allowing the ego to regain mastery over repressed drives and conflicts. And that is the quiet miracle. Not that the pain disappears, but that it no longer disguises itself. You no longer need it to. This is not a return to faith. It is the end of pretending. The end of hiding behind sacred language when what you really feel is abandonment. The end of chasing forgiveness when what you need is to be heard. The end of waiting for redemption when what you need is to grieve. Religion didn't fail you. Your psyche took what it needed and turned it into armor. But now you are ready to remove it, slowly, tenderly, without shame, and stand in what remains, not whole, but true.